Brazil is a country that is located in South America. It occupies nearly half of the continent, covering an area of more than 8 million kilometers squared. Not only is Brazil the largest country in South America, it is the fourth largest in the world, ranking after Russia, Canada, and China.
In the 19th century, Brazil began to flourish to the production of coffee. However, the demand for coffee eventually disappeared due to the Great Depression. For the next half-century, Brazil struggled with government instability, unreliable military, and a fragile economy. Fortunately, Brazil recovered and advanced.
The current population of Brazil is over 200 million people, based on the last United Nations estimates. The population of Brazil makes up 2.77% of the total world population. Brazil also ranks number 5 in the list of countries by population.
Next, I will be covering Brazil's education development. The current Brazilian education system is based on the 1988 Constitution, which highlighted education as a universal right that should be promoted and protected by the government. The Brazilian government has also recognized the value in international education. In an effort to strengthen higher education and increase international cooperation in the STEM fields, the Brazilian government launched the Brazilian Scientific Mobility Program, also known as Science Without Borders, in 2011. This program will grant 100,000 scholarships to Brazilian students to study in the world's top universities in 20 countries, including the United States. One of the biggest issues that Brazil faces, mainly due to a poor public education system, is the fact that nearly 18% of the Brazilian population is functionally illiterate, meaning that they know words and numbers but are unable to comprehend a sentence or perform a simple mathematical operation. Perhaps what is most alarming is that according to the research by IPM related to research company iHope, 30% of Brazilian undergraduates are also functionally illiterate. These figures show how fragile the education system in Brazil is and the difficulties that the government still needs to address in order to sustain the growth of the country. Now, what propositions are there to improve the education system? In 2014, the Brazilian government announced a set of aggressive measurements that will be implemented up until 2024 in order to boost the education system program. This program, dominated P&E, is composed of 21 measures and aims, amongst others, to increase the number of mandatory education years, the percentage of Brazilians going to school and universities, and provide means for teachers to improve their qualifications and skills. To reach the target established by P&E, the government will nearly double the investment in education. In 2012, the government directed 5.3% of the GDP to education, and by 2014, the goal is to raise investments to 10%. The two graphs on the side highlight the mean score for performance in reading and mathematics for both boys and girls in Brazil, along with many other countries. In both graphs, Brazil has the second lowest score after Indonesia, as there is a slight linear increase in their performance for math. By the year 2007, Brazil surpassed Indonesia's score. In the reading performance, however, after a decrease in 2003, from 2006 to 2009, there was an extreme increase which exceeded Indonesia's score. The two areas of development reflect the effect of the policy on the country. Although it somewhat stayed at the same position on the chart, it is close to the other countries' scores than before.
I will be talking about the development of healthcare in Brazil. I will discuss multiple elements that measure the extent of this development. The infant mortality rate of Brazil is 17.5 deaths out of 1,000 live births. That means that there is a very slim chance that each child born will die. In comparison to other countries, Brazil has the 92nd highest infant mortality rate out of a list of 225 countries, the lowest being Monaco, with an excellent rate of 1.8 deaths per 1,000. In comparison, the highest is Afghanistan, with 110 deaths per 1,000. From these statistics, one can determine that Brazil falls around the middle. As one can see when looking at this graph, the infant mortality rate of Brazil has only decreased, with a minor increase in 2015 over the past years. Ways to decrease the current rate would be a better healthcare system and maternity care system. The average infant mortality rate may negatively affect the life expectancy at birth. In Brazil, the life expectancy is 74 years of life. Therefore, 17.5 deaths out of 1,000 live births may bring that down a significant amount. Secondly, one can see the health development of Brazil when they look at their facility access. Their drinking water sources in Brazil has been majorly improved. Today, a total of 98.1% of the population has access to working and clean water sources. This is clearly essential for living. However, their sanitation facilities, such as bathrooms, still need improvement. According to the CIA Fact Book, 17.3% of Brazilians do not have access to sanitation facilities. Since this is also a necessity, this demonstrates that the health of Brazil could still be improved. Finally, as commonly known, HIV and the resulting autoimmune deficiency, known as AIDS, has become increasingly prevalent in the past decades. AIDS can be fatal, thus justifying the relevancy of this factor in terms of development. Currently, in Brazil, there are over 800,000 people living with HIV or AIDS. This is the 11th highest amount in comparison to the rest of the countries in the world. To give context, the list is made of 119 countries, meaning that Brazil is actually very high on the list. The lowest being Croatia, with only 1,500 people living with HIV or AIDS, and the highest is South Africa, with more than 7 million people. To further analyze these statistics, these 800,000 people make up approximately 40% of the Brazilian population. According to the Huffington Post, the number of HIV infections of Brazil makes up more than half of all HIV cases across Latin America. According to the United Nations, this amount will only grow. Since 2016, there has been 44,000 new infections detected in just this last year. In 2005, there were only 40,000 cases discovered. This rate is higher than the population growth of Brazil. To compare, the HIV growth rate is in contrast to the population growth rate. The HIV growth rate is 0.73%. This shows that HIV is an aspect that the Brazilian healthcare could greatly improve in. Overall, Brazil's healthcare has developed positively over the years, but it still has room to grow.
I will be talking about and evaluating the economic development of Brazil from the year 2000 up until 2016. What I will be talking about is the GDP of Brazil, the GDP per capita, and the economic crash after 2013. Firstly, I'm going to define a few key words and phrases that are going to be necessary to know thoroughly. These three phrases are GDP, GDP per capita, and GDP total yearly growth. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. It is defined as the total value of products and services produced by that country. This is the most important economic indicator you need to know about. The second phrase is GDP per capita. GDP per capita is the total value of products and services produced by that country divided by the amount of people living in the country. In other words, the amount of money each person would make if it was put into one big pile and equally split to every person within the country. The third and final phrase is GDP total yearly growth. This is how much the GDP grows annually, so per year. And now a bit of background about Brazil's economy, and then we will go into further detail. Brazil is the 8th largest economy in the entire world. However, when it comes to GDP per capita, it is the 65th, and this is because it has a large population of over 200 million people, which was said before. Whilst looking at this graph you can see here, focus more on where the countries are placed along the x-axis, so the GDP per capita, instead of the y-axis. From looking at this, we can see that Brazil is placed around the $10,000 area for GDP per capita in 2000. We also notice that it is in the top third of the world, since it is mostly on the right side of the graph. Now, if you look at this graph, it represents the same graph, but then of the year 2013. You can see that Brazil has moved more to the right of the graph, which means that GDP per capita has increased. However, this is not a big shock, as most of the countries have done the same movement, although some have moved more than others, which will be elaborated throughout the next graphs. From this graph, you can see the developing countries with big economies such as Russia, India, Mexico, China, Argentina, and of course, Brazil. We can see that Brazil has the highest GDP per capita in 2000 from all these developing countries. This graph also shows that it is of course still lower than developing countries such as the United States, as they are all the way on the other side of the graph. This graph represents the exact same as the previous one, but then of the year 2013 again. We can see that the developing countries highlighted are moving towards the more developed countries. All the countries are increasing in GDP per capita, but so are the developed countries, so every country is developing. From this table, we can see that all the developing countries, with Mexico as an outlier, are increasing by a higher percentage rate than developed countries. For example, Brazil is increased by a percentage of 35%, whilst the United States only increased by 10%, meaning Brazil has a higher increase in the GDP per capita. This shows that Brazil is developing faster than America or other developed countries. Now, from this final graph I created, we can see the economy of Brazil throughout the year 2000 to 2016. It shows that the GDP of Brazil was going very well up until the year 2013. But after 2013, a very drastic crash in the market happened. This happened as the price of commodities such as iron, soybeans, sugar, and coffee, which are a substantial part of Brazil's export, collapsed. This meant that the income from export of Brazil decreased, leading to a stagnation of the Brazilian economy. In conclusion, we can see that Brazil was economically a very fast developing country, but that the development has lost steam since the economic crash in 2014.